Hello, I want to welcome you all and thank you for tuning in to hear Dan's important story tonight. I'm Eden Aronson, volunteer and community events coordinator at JFCS. Our executive director, Michelle Nappel, is with us, but is under the weather, so she's joining us via audio. Michelle and I want to thank Dan for presenting tonight very much, and Joe Lemkin, who brought Dan's story to our attention. We also thank you for being part of this caring and generous community, which supports everything we do at JFCS. Life is very challenging, more challenging than ever with mounting needs, and we are fortunate to serve those needs day after day, more and more with the support and involvement of many of you. I'd like to turn the program over to Joe Lemkin, a valuable board member and an active part of our JFCS family for years, who'll introduce Dan. Keep in mind that if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we can address some of them at the end of the discussion. So Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you, Eden. And thank you all for attending and joining JFCS today for our event with Dan today. I'm very excited to have the author and former Stanford All-American basketball player here to tell his story by the grace of the game. It's whether you're a history buff, sports fan, or simply interested in a terrific character-driven story, by the grace of the game is really inspirational. As personally, as a son of a Holocaust survivor and a huge basketball fan, I was drawn to his book immediately. And so welcome, Dan, and thank you for joining us today. Believe it or not, Dan, I recall being a 16-year-old attending a Knicks game at Madison Square Garden in 1984. And that night, Bernard King scored 60 points. And I received an autograph from your dad. I still have it to this day, and I think you may recall some facts about that game.
Was that the Christmas Day game?
Yes.
My dad jokes with people that him and Bernard combined for 62 points on Christmas.
Yeah.
It was just that Bernard had 60 of them.
But you know, again, your story is really timely for many reasons, and a couple things that really, one thing compelling. Tomorrow we're on the eve of Holocaust Remembrance Day, and also coupled with the surge of anti-Semitism in the United States and the entire world. And what I find particularly concerning and maybe impactful to you are the NBA players and other celebrities that are using social media platforms to foment anti-Semitism. I think specifically the recent incident with Kyrie Irving. And I thought maybe you'd just start off with some maybe insight into that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me to JFCS, and Joe for moderating. Very grateful to be here to share my family's story. We will get to it, right? From the Holocaust to the NBA. It's the only known journey in history. What has been happening in society has been very troubling, and certainly with Kyrie Irving, relevant to my family's history, right? My dad being the only player in NBA history whose parents are Holocaust survivors, hit me very personally, upset me. You know, I think what Kyrie Irving did, right, which was he tweeted a link to a highly anti-Semitic film and book that denies the Holocaust and says Jews are the devil. And there's a lot of just extraordinarily anti-Semitic, problematic themes. That type of thing is really dangerous and really destructive. And I don't think he was quite aware of that, right? But there's precedent, and it happened not too far from the anniversary of Kristallnacht, right? Where we commemorate the Night of Broken Glass, and we remember it when, you know, there were riots across, you know, Germany and other places, and Jewish storefronts were smashed and synagogues were smashed and stores were looted. And that was the culmination of years of rhetoric, of words, you know, and so words really matter, and people with influence sharing these type of messages, it's really, really dangerous. And so it troubled me a lot. I lost sleep over it. I think that there were a lot of instances where Kyrie Irving had the opportunity to apologize, to learn very, you know, early in this process, and he kind of doubled down on some of the things he said. And where I end up on that issue is I'm less concerned actually with Kyrie Irving, because he's one individual and there's always going to be someone with views that are dangerous. What I think is so important is to have the support of others, you know, to have people speak up against that, because my grandmother, who I'll talk so much about today, she still says that, there was a time where we needed voices and we needed people to stand up against all this rhetoric, and there weren't enough of them. And so in this Kyrie Irving situation, I was looking for other NBA players and other people closely, related to him and to this issue to speak up against it. And I was really discouraged and disappointed to see that NBA players didn't have much to say about what he did. And that was highly publicized, and a lot of people kind of made that observation. And so I just think it's all the more reason why we have to speak up, share these histories, let people know how dangerous hate is in any form, right? Whether it's anti-Semitism, racism, whatever it is, we can't have it, we can't stand for it, and it's really upon us to speak up against it. So that was a situation that, was troubling to me and that I took really seriously.
Yeah, and I think I had the same feeling in terms of the silence was deafening, the institutional silence of the NBA, and then the silence of the players individually, because we know how active the NBA is with terms of social justice causes, but here it was an opportunity to talk up about it, anti-Semitism, and to me, it really fell flat. It was virtually non-existent. So yeah, I agree with the silence that was almost more problematic.
And I'll say that the NBA as a league has always stood on the right side of history. They've always been out in front. With this issue, there was a little bit of a delay, and Adam Silver recognized that and acknowledged that. But ultimately, they knew what he did was wrong, was really dangerous, and they did speak up. There was not one active NBA player who made a proactive statement against this. Yeah. One NBA player retweeted something someone else had said, but and to your point, there was a lot of social justice issues where I've been really proud of the NBA players and WNBA players. They've been such leaders. They've really been a force for good. And in this instance where it was clear, blatant, and destructive anti-Semitism, to your point, the silence was deafening. And so again, just motivates me to continue to speak about my family story, to continue to educate, so people know what's at stake when people aren't treated fairly. Because again, there is precedent, and it's very, very dangerous.
Yeah. Well, now let's get to your family story. So your book tells a very commonly heard Jewish story in America on a much larger stage than most will ever reach. It's a common story of the phoenix rising from the ashes, a Jewish family from Europe that has everything taken away, but through grit and determination, achieving success in the United States. And so for those who haven't really had the opportunity to read the book, maybe you could start us off with just a brief overview of the book.
Absolutely. And when I wrote the book, that was my hope, is that my family story is a version of a very relatable human interest story, but it's really a Jewish story. And this is my family's version of it. And so we opened talking about basketball, and was mentioned I was a basketball player at Stanford and had a successful professional basketball career. But it was really my dad who made our family's name synonymous with the game of basketball. He was a high school basketball All-American out of Queens, New York, a college basketball All-American at the University of Tennessee, and a longtime NBA player and executive. He finished his career with the New York Knicks. I know there are Knicks fans here today. He wore number 18 for the Knicks, representing high. He's the only Jewish player ever to wear number 18 for the Knicks. And then he was a 30-year NBA executive. So he's one of the longest tenured lead executives in NBA history. So he's a very, very well-known guy in the world of sports and in the world of basketball, and I'm very proud of him. That all is well known. But what wasn't well known until my book came out is that my dad's the only player in NBA history whose parents survived the Holocaust. And I did a 1.5 years of research preparing to write my book, and that research suggests he's the only athlete in any of the major American sports leagues, the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, or Major League Baseball. He's the only one whose parents are Holocaust survivors. And even though my dad is this very prominent Jewish athlete, he's one of the most prominent Jewish athletes of all time. I had my day in the sun as an athlete. It's my grandmother who is the star of our family and the star of this story. And if anyone on the call has read it, you know that to be true. And hopefully many of you will read it, and you'll definitely know that to be true. My grandmother has a pretty incredible Holocaust survival story, and I go into great detail in the book telling it, and we'll chat about it today some. But she is an inspiration. If she can go through what she went through, overcome what she overcame, and be the type of person that she is today, there is hope for all of us. And so my book really just tells that story. How does a family, some folks survive the Holocaust, but not many, rebuild, flee Europe, come to America, and sports stardom kind of intervenes at a time when it was really needed. And so we'll talk a lot about my grandmother, but you'll all be very happy to know that she will turn 98 years old in June. 2 nights ago, I was on a red-eye flight from California back to the East Coast, where I relocated recently because I was spending some time with her. So, Joe, you know from my book, I write a lot about my grandmother's food. I was eating a lot of it, and actually, she gave me some for my bag on the way home. And as soon as I got home, I took it out and I showed my wife. I said, "You sent us home with some food, so it's in the fridge waiting for me." So, I'm going to talk to you about a hero who did some amazing things during the Holocaust, and she's still alive and well, and the most amazing person in the world.
Yeah. We'll bring it up at the end too, but I thought maybe you could just tell folks how they can get your book or where it's available. Just we'll do it now, and also at the end we can remind everyone.
Please, I mean, it's available where books are sold. I always say Amazon is your best bet. I'm very grateful that the hardcover version of my book sold out fairly quickly, and they went to paperback to kind of satisfy the demand, which was very cool. But Amazon is the only place that still has the hardcover. So they have the hardcover and the paperback. So plenty of supply there, and wherever else you care to get your book. So again, just very, very grateful for folks, reading and spreading the story, Joe, precisely because of what you said about Kyrie Irving. It's never been more important for people to be educated about the Holocaust, what the Jewish people have been through, and you can relate that to other underrepresented groups who have been through, experienced prejudice and things like that. And so, as the generation of Holocaust survivors gets older, it's really incumbent upon us, to share these stories. And so that's really always been my hope with my book. So yeah, sharing it, reading it, talking about it is so greatly appreciated and necessary today.
Absolutely. So have you always wanted to write this book? And if so, what compelled you to do it so at this point now?
I've always loved to write. And so, growing up, my dad was an NBA basketball player and then an executive, and I was a basketball player. And so that's what I was known for. And that's what everyone always thought I would do. And my mom would say, he's going to be a writer, because she knew that when I would come home from practice, I would write stories and I would write poems. And I just always loved to write. And when I was playing professional basketball, I had contributing writing positions to several websites, and some of the things I've written had done well. And I just love to do it. And I think for a story like this, it has to be something that you can't not tell. And that's what this was for me. Story that was in my heart. I always drew such incredible inspiration and motivation for knowing what my grandparents overcame, what my dad overcame. It gave me the hope and really the luxury to dream big. And I got to Stanford, and I played basketball at Stanford, which was my dream from the time I was 12 years old. And it was a real long shot. And I write in my book, for a slow Jewish kid from the suburbs playing at a top program at the time, didn't seem like it should be in the cards for me. But I had seen, I had this example of what was possible. And so that always just was such a profound feeling to me, and knowing what basketball did for my family. So after I retired as a basketball player, I went to business school, and I had some space to explore some other interests. And this is, you couldn't keep me away from this. And that's, I think, when good things happen, when you put your heart into something, and when you do it because you think it needs to be told. And I always tell people, I worked on this book for 5 years before it came out. You don't write a book to really make money or get famous. Those things really don't happen. And if they do, you're just very lucky. But you have to just have a story to tell, and have something that you can't not tell to people. And that was really my experience.
Right. Well, now we've already brought your grandma up a couple of times, and I was particularly fascinated with your incredibly close relationship with her and her food particularly. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit more about her and the bond and how that developed over the years.
I will, and then I'll also maybe go back and tell a little bit of her story.
Yes, absolutely.
Right, John? Okay, I'll do that. Our bond is very special. It always has been. I wanted to go to Stanford from the time I was 12 years old, because my grandmother lived and has lived for many, many years, 25 minutes from their campus. And, I lived on the East Coast in northern New Jersey in Bergen County. But when I was visiting my grandmother, when I was, in 6th grade, we visited Stanford's campus. And I said, wow, this is where I want to be, close to my grandma, great school, great program. And so when I did play at Stanford, she came to every single home game. She picked up my dirty laundry on Sundays, dropped off my clean laundry, stocked my fridge. We just have this incredibly close relationship. We still talk. We talk every single day, FaceTime with my boys. She is my hero. I mean, everything that I can hope to be in life is, I look at her example. And so it's not only what she has been through and what she's overcome, but who she is today, how she treats people, how she approaches life. Again, and Joe, you've read the book, like I've had people from all over the world. I had someone last night because I spoke about the book in public, and a man shook my hand and told me that my book was, very profound to him and had a very special place in his heart. And he started crying and he said, "Your grandmother was such an inspiration for me. She reminds me of my mother," and so she has that power. She has that effect on people, and it's who she is. I wrote the book, but when people compliment me, I say, listen, it would have been a lot more impressive if I would have made these things up, right? I couldn't have conjured up a character like her, right? She is the real deal. And so I'll tell the group here a little bit about her background. My grandmother's from Transylvania on the border of Romania and Hungary. She was born into a big, happy Orthodox Jewish family. There were 10 siblings total, including her, 2 loving parents. And I go to great lengths in the book to talk about what life was like before the Holocaust, because we know the numbers, 6 million Jews killed and millions more, but these weren't numbers. These were people, these were human beings. And so it was so important for me, for my readers to know that, right? To know who these people were, that they weren't just numbers. And, my grandmother, where she grew up, they had no technology, they had no running water, no electricity, no roads. They did not, there was just tracks drawn, carved in the mud with horse-drawn carriages, right? That's how kind of primitive it was compared to what we have now. But they had so much love and so much laughter in their home. When the Nazis invaded, my grandmother happened to be visiting an older sister in Budapest. She was 16 years old. She had a chance to survive on the run. So she hid in bombed out buildings. She scraped and clawed for food wherever she could find it. She has every quality a person would need to survive something like the Holocaust. She was savvy, disciplined, likable. She just everything, great will, tremendous will to live. But she's also very humble, because she'll say you could have had all those things back then and it didn't matter. You needed luck and you needed help. And she had a great deal of both those things. And in my book, you can read about the soldier who gave her a piece of bread when she was starving. Someone gave her a pair of pants, which kept her warm during the winter months in Budapest. Someone gave her a kiss on the cheek at one point, which gave her hope. The most help my grandmother got was from Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Wallenberg. If not, please Google him, because that's the face of a hero, credited for saving roughly 100,000 Jews in Budapest during the Holocaust. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. is on Raoul Wallenberg Way, to give you an example of how prominent he is. He issued Schutz passes. There were protective passports which gave Jews in Budapest a level of security. So he was a Swedish diplomat, not Jewish, but he came to Budapest to help the Jews. My grandmother was able to get a pass for herself, but she risked her life to obtain 17 passes for other people, which she distributed to her sisters, to her friends, to people she didn't even know who just needed help. So when I tell you that she's not only my hero, she's also a hero, it's the truth. Eventually, those passes were no longer recognized because of a change in government. She was caught by the Nazis. She was put in the Budapest ghetto. She was reunited with one of her brothers in the ghetto, and the Nazis stayed out of the ghetto. Jews administered daily life. And at the end of the war, my grandmother and her brother saw 20 Nazis enter the ghetto with machine guns over their shoulders, and word quickly spread that they were there to kill the remaining 80,000 Jews in the ghetto. And so my grandmother and her brother raced up the stairs of the building that they were sleeping in. They found a small attic space, room for about 4 or 5 people. There were more than a dozen packed in there fighting for their lives, right? And they waited for 5 minutes and 20 minutes and an hour, and nothing happened. They eventually checked, and the Nazis had retreated. And soon the ghetto was liberated, and my grandmother was free to go home. That was 1945. She didn't know why the Nazis retreated that day, but she wasn't asking any questions. She also didn't know what had happened to her family, right? Her brother was with her, and one of her sisters was also in the ghetto, but in another location. She didn't know what had happened to her family. But that was 1945. In 1985, my grandmother is living in the Bay Area. My dad is a big basketball star. He's playing in the NBA, and a movie was made about Raoul Wallenberg's life, and Richard Chamberlain played the title character. And it was in that movie that my grandmother saw one of the final scenes of Wallenberg learning about an order to massacre the remaining 80,000 Jews in the Budapest ghetto. He gets in his car, he races to the ghetto's gates, he confronts the general, the only man with the authority to call off the massacre, and he tells them, "Let these people go. They're innocent. I will personally guarantee that you hang for this. You must let these people go. And he talked the general out of committing the massacre. So it took my grandmother 40 years to learn that Wallenberg saved her life, not just once, but twice during the Holocaust. When she got home, she would learn that 5 of her siblings and both of her parents were killed.
That's tremendous. The story about Raoul Wallenberg. Wow, that is compelling. It's unbelievable how one person could impact so many.
And Joe, I'll tell you something that actually I learned from my grandmother a month ago. I was visiting with her, and she still sheds tears over Wallenberg because he saved her. I wouldn't be here today. I quite literally wouldn't be here today without him. And she cries over him. She says, he did everything for us, and there was nothing we could do for him because he was apprehended by the Russians after the war, and he was never seen again. So he risked his life, and he ultimately lost his life to stand up for what was right and to protect people who needed it. And this is the thing that I wasn't aware of. I wish I would have been, because I would have written it in my book. At the time that Raoul Wallenberg did all this, he was 32 years old.
Wow.
My grandma said that, and I just, it struck me because he's a hero and he saved all these people. And I just imagine, someone in later in life, he was 32 years old. So a young man who just did the right thing and will forever be a hero.
That's amazing. I know in the book also you talk. I remember reading about I think it was your grandma that they had a retail business in the Bronx. So maybe tell about like how they, if I'm remembering correctly, how they kind of came to the United States and how that started to uplift themselves. And because it was very similar to me. My father came through the Holocaust and he had a retail store in the Bronx, so it just seemed very relatable.
Yeah. That's it. So
yeah.
My grandfather was a prisoner in a forced labor camp in Hungary during the Holocaust. He lost both sisters and both parents. So he lost everyone. And my grandparent, I remember asking my grandma when I was interviewing her for the book, how do you go on? How do you rebuild, right? She had 5 siblings murdered, parents murdered. And she said, we started families. That's what people did. And so my grandparents, they got together shortly after the war. They started a family. So my uncle was born not long thereafter. My dad was born 8 years later, under communism in Romania. Again, no running water in the home, had to use an outhouse, right? Grew up very, very differently than I did. And I'm honest about that in the book, right? I'm born into such great privilege. My dad was an NBA basketball player at the time of my birth. And just to give you an example of how I came into the world, my birth was scheduled around the NBA basketball calendar. So my dad was a player for the New York Knicks, and he had 2 long road trips. I was delivered by C-section. And so my parents scheduled my birth so he could go on one road trip. He was there when I was born. He went on another road trip, and he was there for my bris. And so basketball and Judaism, right, was really how I came into the world. But I had, such privilege, such advantage, so many opportunities. My dad had none of that. He had an older brother who he loved so much, and he had great loving parents. And he says that he had a wonderful childhood because he didn't know anything different. He didn't know what communism was. And he didn't have toys growing up. And my grandmother still will say that, that because it was communism, they didn't have anything. It took them 10 years to leave Romania. And it was actually the state of Israel that paid for each Jewish family that the communists would allow to leave. My family spent 6 months in Rome before leaving. And they, at the end of their stay in Rome, found a way to get to the United States of America. As you know, Joe, because you read the book, there are some great stories about how my family was able to smuggle their illegal money out of Romania to the United States. I would encourage people, read the book for a lot of reasons, but you'll really like those stories without spoiling anything. You couldn't take anything of value out of the country, and you weren't allowed to have money. So my grandparents had friends who were jailed, tortured, or killed for even having illegal money. And my grandparents had $1,000 worth of Romanian money and 4,000 American dollars, which was a fortune for them. They saved that over 10 long years of, I read the book, turning profits out of nothing. And they got every cent of their money out of communist Romania. The Romanian money was a daring scheme that my grandfather kind of conceptualized and executed. The American money, which was much more dangerous and trickier. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. My grandparents were improbably able to elicit the help of one of the biggest comedians in the United States of America, a guy named Buddy Hackett, who's world famous comedian. And so you can read in my book how Buddy Hackett smuggled my grandparents illegal money out of Romania for them. So there was a lot that went into my grandparents getting and my family getting from Romania to the United States. But after 6 months in Rome, they got to the United States. landed at JFK Airport in 1964. My dad spoke fluent Hungarian, Romanian, and Italian, didn't speak a word of English, and had never touched a basketball. I mentioned my uncle, who was 8 years older than my dad. What my dad called my uncle in their native language, Hungarian, translates to English as my king. That's how much my dad loved, revered, looked up to his older brother. My family was living the American dream just by being in America. It was the first time my grandparents could work for a living, right? And just make a living and keep what they made. Their sons could get an education. They had freedom. They could speak, right? They could say what they believed. This in and of itself was the American dream. A few months after arriving in the United States, my uncle was diagnosed with leukemia, and he passed away within a year. And so despite all the tragedy of the Holocaust and all the loss, this was the biggest tragedy for my grandparents to lose their son and for my dad to lose a brother. Crushing loss, hole that still can't be filled. And I'm very honest about this in the book. I'm named after my uncle. His name was Lutzi in Hungarian, but Leslie in English. And my middle name is Leslie after him. And I carry that with me. I've always felt that obligation. You know, as was mentioned in my introduction, I had success at Stanford as a student and as an athlete. A lot of that was because of him. You know, I know that I have loved ones, not only from the Holocaust, but also my uncle who didn't get a chance to live their dreams, right? And I have all these opportunities, and I was really motivated to make the most of them. And so you can put yourself in my dad's shoes in this moment. He's 10 years old. Kids in Queens, New York are making fun of him because he doesn't speak the language. My grandparents are working 6 and 7 days a week to build a life in America, and they opened up a fabric store in the Bronx. And that's what they did. And so my dad, he was looking for belonging, looking for friends, looking to learn the language, and really to heal from this terrible loss. And so he started going to the playgrounds in Queens. And what they did at the playgrounds is they played basketball. And sometimes things just click. And my book is called By the Grace of the Game. And we titled it that for a reason. You know, the game shined its light on my family when we needed it. It didn't take long for my dad to be one of the best players in the park, and then one of the best players in the city, and then one of the best players in the country. And so by the time he was a senior in high school, he was an All-American, one of the greatest players in New York City, truly a phenomenon, someone who was unstoppable, and he would not have flown so far so fast with basketball had it not been taking him away from these terrible tragedies that were so painful for him. So it was, you know, sports are amazing because they change lives in so many ways. And for my dad, basketball was salvation. And, you know, it was the most fun part of the book to write for me, right? Just that ascension, not only him as a basketball player, but my grandparents, you know, their fabric store, building a life, healing from this loss of my uncle and all their family, and finding meaning, right? And basketball helped our family do that. And so I had to write about what happened to my family in Auschwitz and my uncle passing. But I got to write this amazing, triumphant story. And, you know, I always say there's a lot of darkness in my family story, but there's much more light. And kind of this ascension is part of that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things as you're talking, I'm thinking about a couple little vignettes from the book that I really enjoyed. Like one, when you're talking about your dad on the playing in the parks in New York. I remember the years later him coming back and playing against this kid that kind of bullied him, and then exacting some revenge, which was really nice.
I won't have time to tell the whole story, but it's a great one.
Yeah.
So let's just, again, my dad was vulnerable when he came to the United States because he had lost his brother. He didn't speak English. I mean, kids really picked on him. He was very big, and he's a 6'6". He's a very big guy. It helped him as an athlete. But when he was young and vulnerable, there was a kid who picked on him. And when they were playing basketball, and he slammed his face onto the floor of the pavement over and over again and bloodied his whole face, right? As a young person. And my dad didn't forget that. Years later, when my dad now was one of the best players in the city, one of the biggest players too, this kid came back. And, you know, sometimes the tables turn, and my dad I talked to someone who went to high school with him yesterday who came to see me speak, and he said, you know, your dad was so approachable, not just from his friends, but for everyone. He's still that way. He is the nicest, kindest guy. He knows what it's like not to be treated fairly, so he treats everyone with respect. But this person didn't do the right thing, and then the tables turned, and my dad handled it. And you read in the book, and it's a great story.
Yeah, that's might as well continue a little bit more about your dad. Obviously, he's a big. I know your grandmom's a star, but he's obviously a star too. And I just reading about college basketball and how he ended up at Tennessee. I just find that compelling. Or
Yeah. My dad played basketball at the University of Tennessee. Back then, there was no Big East, and so the great players from New York City went down south. They actually called it the Pipeline of the South. Knoxville, Tennessee is in East Tennessee, pretty close to New York City. So my grandmother was happy, you know, wouldn't be too hard to visit. My dad thought he could play right away. He was a 4-time All-SEC player at Tennessee. You know, he teamed with another great New Yorker, Bernard King, and they became one of the greatest college basketball duos of all time. They were called the Ernie and Bernie Show. You know, Bernard is a black man from Brooklyn. My dad is a white immigrant from Queens. So they're from the same city, but they're from very different worlds. They became legends separately and together. They also played together in the NBA for the Knicks, as we were talking about. You know, well, Bernard led the NBA in scoring. My dad was his backup. That's why I made the joke they combined for 62, right? But at Tennessee, they both averaged more than 25 points per game one year. They were on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and they still talk every month, which is really amazing, right? Basketball brought these two guys together, and I call him Uncle B, you know. And so my dad had an unbelievable career at Tennessee. You know, he graduated he ended his career as the school's all-time leading scorer and as the second leading scorer in the history of the conference. And today, he's still the 5th leading scorer in the history of the conference. So that little boy that I told you about, right, who came to the United States without speaking English, not touching a basketball, lost his brother, he really did become this phenomenon through the game of basketball. And there was such healing for my grandparents, for my dad, such a sense of purpose. And so, that relates a little bit to my journey with basketball, which I'm very honest about. All the pressure I felt, the pressure I put on myself, because I knew what the game had done for us. You know, so it's hard enough to, you know, listen, I'm privileged in so many ways and I had so many advantages and I own those things, but it's hard when you have a dad or a mom who's famous and prominent in what you want to do, right? It puts pressure on you. And I felt the added pressure of just knowing that basketball saved us from a lot. And so, but a lot of that really happened at Tennessee. And I'll tell you probably what's my favorite part of the book. So when my dad was a sophomore at Tennessee, he was invited to play for the United States national team, just in an international competition. And actually what's funny about that is at the end of practice, the coaches said, okay, bring your passports tomorrow because we're going overseas in a few days. And my dad had to go up to them after practice and say, listen, I don't have a passport, but I have a green card. And they were shocked. They said, wait a second, this is the USA national team. You, of course, have to be a citizen. I mean, I thought you were from New York. And he said, well, not originally. My dad came when he was 9 years old, just old enough not to have an accent, right? He still speaks fluent Hungarian. That's his native language, but they had no idea. And I told you it took my grandparents 10 years to get visas to leave Romania. My dad was eligible for his United States citizenship because he had been in the country for more than 10 years. They flew my dad to Washington, D.C. All his papers were filled out. He returned to Providence, Rhode Island, where they were practicing the next day with his passport in hand. So it took my grandparents 10 years, took my dad 24 hours, right? Because of his ability as a basketball player. But a year later, when my dad was a junior at Tennessee, he was able to try out for the United States Olympic team. And he made the Olympic team. And so my grandparents drove from Queens, New York to Montreal, Canada. They shut their fabric store for 2 weeks, which was like unthinkable. You know, they were just really about work. And so they shut their store, they drove to Montreal, and they watched my dad become a gold medalist for the United States of America, right? So you could imagine standing on the top of the Olympic podium wearing the stars and stripes. That was a dozen years after coming to America, having never been here, not speaking the language. And so that to me is the pinnacle, right? Like my dad had played 9 years in the NBA and had a very successful career as an executive, but to stand on top of the Olympic podium wearing the stars and stripes after my grandparents survived the Holocaust and lost their family and really fought they fled communism under duress and they lost their son. My dad lost his brother, but to keep going, to not give up, to love each other, to believe, you know, those are the themes of the book, right? That's why it's inspired me so much over my life. And it's had an impact on others as well, because it's just the type of story that can make you believe that things are possible.
Yeah. Man, I was going to ask you this at the end if I thought, but I got to ask you, have you been approached or anyone considering making a movie? Because it's such an amazing story just on so many different levels, the trajectory of the family down, up, and you know, the different, you know, the NBA perspective, the Holocaust, just wondering.
Yeah. So I mentioned that I was visiting my grandmother in California this weekend. We were filming. And so so thank you for the question. we agreed with a filmmaker to do a documentary, and so that's in progress. We've also talked to studios about an actual motion picture, which hasn't had traction. It hasn't happened yet. If maybe it will, maybe it won't, but we've gotten that feedback. And again, I didn't create this. You know, if I would have made it up and they want to make a movie, it'd be like, wow, but this is just how it happened, right? It's the only example in history of someone's parents surviving the Holocaust, coming to America and becoming a professional athlete in that way, right? I think the story is about the right things. You know, it's about love, and it's about family, and it's about work, and it's about believing. And so that struck a chord. And it would be a dream if it I mean, the documentary is amazing and very cool, and we're excited about that. But if there was other things to do, like, I would love it. But I think everything has to happen in its due time, right? It's like right place, right time. And so I'm talking to groups often, and I'm just trying to spread the word about the book, because you never know when someone will read it in a position to say, this should be a movie.
Yeah, well, while we we didn't really talk about his career with the Knicks. We have the playing career and the GM career. What particularly stood out to me was, I think you told in the book about how he really had put together, I forget what year it is, the team that went on to be very successful for the Knicks, and then he was separated from the Knicks. So that was a compelling part of your story, that he essentially made this powerhouse team. I forget, is that with the Mason and Ewing era, or?
It was, but Mason was not there. But that was in 1999. So my dad was but keep in mind that when my dad was new to this country and lost his brother, my dad used to take the subway from Queens after school. My grandfather would take the subway from the Bronx. They'd meet at Madison Square Garden. They would buy the cheapest tickets in the house, because that's what they could afford. And they would sit top row of the bleachers and watch the Knicks. And that's where my dad learned English, healed from that loss, just watching the Knicks. His number 22 is retired at the University of Tennessee. He wore that number because of Dave DeBusschere, the great New York Knicks player who played with a lot of heart, right? That's how my dad kind of learned the game. Years later, not only does he become a player for the Knicks, but then he's running the team. You know, I grew up watching Knicks games from a private skybox because my dad's the GM and president of the team. And again, that's the privilege aspect. And so my dad, it was this rose that grew from concrete story. He had fought so hard, and here he is running his childhood team, the team he played for. And in 1999, he made some controversial trades. He traded John Starks and Charles Oakley, guys who were fixtures of the New York Knicks. They were the heart and soul of the team. My dad took a risk, and he said, we need to get younger. And he's traded for Latrell Sprewell and Marcus Camby. And it took a while for it to come together. And my dad was let go 8 games before the regular season ended. And the Knicks were 500, right, which was unacceptable for a team of their caliber. They made the playoffs as the 8th seed. They upset the Miami Heat in the first round, and they went to the NBA Finals. But my dad had been fired already, and there were fans in Madison Square Garden. There were who brought Ernie Grunfeld masks, like little faces, and someone paid for a billboard that said "Bring Ernie back." Right? I think it struck a chord, because this is, after Europe, he was a New Yorker from Forest Hills High School in Queens, right? Native son, played for the Knicks, ran the Knicks, and so that was very hard for me as a kid. I grew up with the orange and the blue, and that was all I knew. And it was also it really was triggering, because the theme of not being treated fairly, right? That's for me still in my life. That's something that's very hard for me. Listen, my dad never had grandparents. They were all killed in Auschwitz, and so to have that background and to come to America the way he did and be picked on and to overcome, again, he treats people really the right way, but he wasn't treated, so fairly in that situation. And that was really hard. He was hired right away by the Milwaukee Bucks. He built great teams there. They went to Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals. He was then signed by the Washington Wizards, where he was there for 17 years. So he had this storybook career as an executive. But that situation with the Knicks when I was a freshman in high school at Ramapo High School, which we talked about earlier. Yeah, that was hard.
Yeah. Well, so I think we want to get to the questions from the audience soon, but I had one just final point, sure, and then we could turn to it. So just obviously Society Day, the significance of diversity and inclusion, just so significant and important and always out there. And I think your book is really a testament to the importance of these issues, and whether it's Raoul Wallenberg or the story of the Bernie and Ernie show, or even you had Ray Allen write the foreword to your book. And I think maybe just speak about, I don't know if you go into each one individually, but that's a general concept and all these relationships of how different groups supporting each other.
So I mentioned earlier, like when we were talking about Kyrie Irving, the Jewish people, we needed voices then and we need voices now. We also need to be voices for other groups who are not being treated fairly, right? And so, and I think my grandfather, you know, after surviving the Holocaust, he taught my dad, and my dad always told that to me growing up. We called my grandfather Apu. He passed away when I was a baby, but he said, Apu always said, you treat everyone as an individual and you get to know them as a person. Don't make any assumptions about them for any quality, the color of their skin, their religion, anything about them. You have to get to know people for themselves, and then you make a determination. And I think when you come from a group who hasn't been treated that way over time, you become very sensitive to that. And so for me, it's so important. You know, I talk about the Holocaust, but I also stand up for other groups, you know, and that's why I said when I was disappointed and upset that I didn't hear the voices for the Jewish community, I try to be a voice for others. And it's so important. And so you mentioned Ray Allen wrote the foreword for my book. Ray Allen is an NBA Hall of Famer. You know, he led the NBA in 3-point shots made before Steph Curry broke his record recently, but he's an icon. You know, he's a Black American man. He's not Jewish, but he saw Schindler's List in college and he was moved. And he said, this isn't just a Jewish tragedy, this is a human tragedy. And so once he became a big basketball star, he committed to this cause. And every time his teams played in Washington, D.C., he would take teammates to the Holocaust Museum. He's been to Auschwitz and he's taken groups to Auschwitz. He's such an advocate for Holocaust education that President Obama appointed him to the board of the Holocaust Museum in 2016. I'm lucky to have a relationship with Ray because my dad was the general manager of the Bucks when Ray was a star player. We didn't know that Ray was committed to Holocaust education, and Ray didn't know that my dad's parents were Holocaust survivors because my dad never talked about it. He had been to our house, right? And so I connected with Ray when, you know, the book was, I had written it, and I told him, and he said, Ernie, you know, he had no idea. And I just asked him, I said, listen, Ray, this is really important. And would you be willing to stand with this story? And he didn't hesitate. He said, Dan, whatever you need, I'm with you. And so his jersey was hanging on my wall when I was in high school because I looked up to him so much. But I say this often, it's true. I look up to him more now for the type of person he is because he really makes a difference, makes an impact. So yeah, my book is a small part of this, right? Is of educating people, of letting people experience what others have been through. And my hope is that people stand up for themselves and for others because we all need each other, right? There's so much darkness, but we need to be the light.
Yeah. So either I think that we did. I'm not sure if we had a couple questions in the chat, and if you wanted to answer those. I'm not able to see them, I don't think. But.
Yeah. So here's one question, Dan. How open was your grandmother to sharing her story with you, with your dad, and then with you? Because we all know sort of typically survivors can't or won't share their details. And did it take years for her to open up, or like, how did you learn the actual story?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's so true. You often find it's a binary with survivors. And Joe, your parents, right? I mean, I'm sure you saw it. And either they don't want to talk about it or they can't talk about it. And you, of course, have to respect that. But there's another side where they feel obligated to. And my grandmother's in the latter camp, and I'm just lucky for that. Growing up, when I was in college, as an adult, she just always was very open about it. And yeah, I didn't tell her or my dad that I was writing a book. Actually, when I interviewed them, I wanted to create a safe space with no expectations. I just said, I have something in mind. I just want to know the family's history. My grandmother, and she has an amazing memory too, so if you read the book, there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of depth, and she's responsible for that. Not only because of what she can remember, but what she was willing to tell. There were a few times where she said, I don't want to tell you this because there were some details that were really hard. But if you really want me to and you need me to, I will. And every time she said that, I said, I need to hear it. You know, and she would tell me things about people being killed in very gruesome ways or things she saw that are highly upsetting. But she told me, and I'm just lucky for that. And you know, one thing she had always said to me is that one of her biggest fears is that no one will know her family ever existed. They were just taken to Auschwitz and they were never seen again. And she always says they don't have graves to visit, they don't have death certificates, they're just gone. So she talked about them. That was her way, I think, of processing. And now I'm proud because I wrote the book and they live in the book, right? So their stories are told. But thank you for that question. And again, I know Holocaust survivors and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who they do not talk about it. And I always say, you have to respect that, right? Because people process these things the way they're going to.
Yeah, thank you. A question came in. you like to write. Do you have another book or another story to share? What else might inspire you to write?
Yeah, I do. I love to write. I do. I think like writing's in you. You know, either you do it or you don't. Like I don't make the decision to write. I just write because I love to do it. And yes, I do have another book in me. I want to write more. I just love the whole process and what it means. This wasn't the first book I wrote. When I was playing professional basketball, I wrote a book for kids about basketball, and it got close to getting published, but it didn't get published, and it's actually still on the shelf. But and as I told you, this book, it took me 5 years. The book has done well and it's traveled. And I said, we're making a movie, right? These are all good things. I was rejected by a dozen publishers before I found one. You know, so I always tell groups of kids who are like, maybe they're impressed by what I did, or I say, don't be. This is elbow grease and hard work, just like anything else, you know, and you can do things if you kind of put your mind to it. And that's what this has been for me. By the way, Harry Potter was rejected 12 times, and that did just a little bit better than my book, right? So this is not like a story that's never been told before, but it's true, right? So, I mean, so many more people didn't believe in this project than did, but I believed in it, and it was really important for me to tell it, so I did that. But I actually have a couple ideas that I'm noodling now. I mean, my heart is still with this, and I want to speak about it and work on the movie, and because this story is my soul on a page. This is what my grandparents went through, my dad went through. I want this to travel as far as wide as it can. But yes, later on, I do want to keep writing.
Great. One other question. So how do you plan to share your family's history with your kids? In the sense that, as we know, there's no sort of Holocaust history class. There's no Jewish history really around, a little bit in Hebrew school, some in day school, but how do you plan on taking care of that so that, you know, they're part of sharing the message that you're part of?
Couple things. So one, we can be agents of change. So Holocaust education is not mandated in every state. In fact, I think there are more states where it's not required than it is required. We all have voices to change that, and I plan on doing that. I mean, listen, whether I'm the one who spearheads that change remains to be seen, but I'm not going to just be satisfied with Holocaust education not being mandatory, because it's so important, not just for Jewish people, for all people, particularly for all people. And the data is really horrifying. If you look at millennials and how little they know about the Holocaust and what humans are capable of, and what some people have been through. And so that's one part of it, is just continuing to commit to being an agent of change, sharing my story. Hopefully that leads to more people being exposed to this history. So not going out without a fight on that front, right? We want that education to be in schools. As it relates to my children, it has to be the right time. You know, my grandmother and my parents were always really good about that. I knew, and I write about this in the book, I always had a sense that something bad had happened. And in an age-appropriate way, my parents, my grandmother, they told me what the Holocaust was. And then as I got older, of course, more details emerged. And I'll do the same with my children. My wife and I have talked about, like, this bar mitzvah age, the right age to hand them the book, maybe. You know, I think, you know, my book, you know, 11, 12, 13 has been probably a good age for folks to start, depending on maturity level. But it's, you know, so I think I'll probably hand them the book for their bar mitzvahs, and, you know, start kind of just, they have that. So they'll know the story from that. And I'll encourage them. We'll take them to the Holocaust Museum. We'll show them my grandmother's tape, you know, from the Shoah Foundation, because this is where we come from, you know, and so it's really important.
Absolutely. A question comment came in. Dan, this is Howard Levy, former player and coach at Princeton and current coach at Mercer County Community College. I wanted to tell you that I loved your book, and I also consider your dad a friend. He's been very good to me over the years.
Howard, so great to hear from you. Thank you for that comment. Really appreciate that. And as soon as you said Howard Levy, I said, oh, that name sounds familiar. So we're wishing you all the best. And yeah, just thank you for that.
That's great. Joe, any additional questions? Those are the ones in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the thoughts I had is, now this is the second time I've done a talk with you, and I'm just wondering, from, you know, you've obviously been presenting all over the country, is there any how the book is generally being received, and particularly anything surprising in the reception of the book by anyone specific, or any multiple?
Yeah, I've written a lot publicly. Like, I publish a lot of articles and things before I wrote, and one of my observations was, regardless of what you write, people will always have something negative to say, right? And I'd experienced that, and I was prepared for that, and I haven't had that with the book, which has been really amazing. I think people recognize that this is an important story and it's an amazing story, but it's also a very honest story. It's someone just putting their heart on the line, and I think people can relate to that. I've been overwhelmed by the support. Listen, yeah, it's been more than I could have asked for. And as I mentioned, I had a gentleman last night, and I didn't mention this the first time around. He's cried, right? He said that my grandmother reminded me of his mother, but he said, and he's probably in his 70s, he said, your book is the best book that I've ever read. It's my favorite book, and so it's his favorite. So that, and then he actually went on to ask a question, and I interrupted him. I said, don't go on from this, just leave it there. You said what you did, but that's one man who thinks that. And if he might be the only one, but I have one, and it's just it's very gratifying. I mean, people know my grandmother, that, and she's touching people. And I'll tell you something that was very cool that happened about 2 weeks ago. Because people email me really from all over the world who have touched, like Howard today made this very kind comment. My dad has touched a lot of people and has intersected with a lot of people, even from Transylvania, where my dad's from Hungary. I have people reaching out. Oh, I grew up in the village and I saw what your dad became. There's a lot of people from around the world. 2 weeks ago, I got an email from someone with the last name Hackett, and it was Buddy Hackett's son. And again, Joe, you know the story, but people could read the book. Like, Buddy Hackett did something amazing for our family, and I told this story. And when the book came out, I actually researched his children, because I said, I should reach out to them, because he did this incredible thing. And Buddy Hackett's word travels, and he found out about the story, and someone sent him the book, or sent him the part of the book, and he emailed me, and we got on the phone and we talked for a half hour. And so it was just things like that have been really cool, really rewarding. I'll tell you one thing, actually, Joe, that I'll never forget, which was very cool. My dad played at Tennessee, where he was this huge star, and so people from Knoxville have been reaching out. And this woman reached out to me. She said, I grew up in Knoxville, and your dad was our hero. Me and my sister were younger, and Ernie posters all over the wall. He was very, very popular in Knoxville. And she said, we went to his basketball camp, the Ernie Grunfeld basketball camp. And my sister got the top award that he presented her, which was the Ernie Grunfeld ball for best camper or something. And she said, but you know what? My sister wasn't that good of a basketball player. And we never quite understood why she got that award. But then we read your book and we talked about it. And she was getting picked on at camp. And these girls were picking on her, and she didn't quit, and she kept going. And my dad saw, and she said, when I read your book and I read your dad's story, I understood why he lifted her up, because that was him. Wow. He was that person, and so it was just so heartfelt and meaningful, to know that my dad had touched this, he was a college kid. He didn't say anything because he doesn't really talk about these things. There's a lot of acts of kindness that I've heard about. Him and Bernard King actually sent someone to private school who was having behavioral issues that they saw something in. Bernard told me that. He said, when your dad and I sent this kid to private school, I said, what? Because your dad didn't tell you that? I said, no. And I said, Dad, did you and Bernard pay for a kid to go to private school to get his life together? He said, oh, yeah, we did that. No one cares less about his own story than my dad. He's very low key and humble, but I've had all these things come out that have just been terribly rewarding.
While you're talking about your dad and that story particularly made me think of something you don't really understand his popularity, but one show, the ESPN documentary on the Bernie and Ernie show, and then you realize they were maybe you want to talk about that for a minute. I mean, that was just unbelievable to watch. It was like the Beatles of documentary.
It was, which I can laugh. My sister and I were rolling our eyes, right? It's your dad. But yeah, ESPN made a documentary film, a 30 for 30, called Bernie and Ernie, about Bernard and my dad, precisely for the reasons I mentioned. Black man from Brooklyn, white immigrant from Queens. Bernard grew up in extreme poverty. My dad's parents were Holocaust survivors, and they became truly larger than life. And they were like the Beatles, screaming, there's a story about, in the movie about they had cutouts of all the players around campus, and my dad's cutouts kept disappearing, and they said people are stealing Ernie's cutouts, and they'd always end up in the sorority houses and around, he was larger than life there. And and they were brash. You know, they were from New York City, and they played like a very fancy, upbeat style. And people, if you weren't at the University of Tennessee, you hated them. But if you were at Tennessee, you adored them. And I'll tell you, it's almost embarrassing, actually, the adoration that he still has there. He actually, like, when I'd like to go to Knoxville with him because I'd never been, and he kind of repels from the spotlight, and so he doesn't want to, like. But I tell him, Dad, it'd be really cool just for me to go there. And someone called me from Knoxville, and they said to me, Dan, your dad is not a superstar in Knoxville; he is a god. And I said, okay, slow down. Like, that's a little much for me. But that was kind of for people who saw that happen, and they really put Knoxville on the map. It's kind of that big for them. And so, and again, link it back to his roots and where he came from, for him to kind of get into that environment where he's like a Beatle on campus there after being this immigrant, you know. So that's, yeah, it's a fun part of the story. And the documentary shows it, you know, they show them on campus, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Joe. We have time for one last question, I guess.
I was just going to open it up to see, Dan, if you had any final thoughts, because we're going to wrap up. And first, absolutely thank you. It was just amazing having you. I could do this numerous times. Just love talking about your story and your dad, but and your grandma, everyone. But either way, if you had any final comments that you wanted to wrap up with,
Joe, let's do it again. We have a good track record.
Yeah.
I want to thank JFCS for having me, giving me this opportunity to tell my family story. Joe, thank you, of course, for facilitating this conversation, and you were, you know, the kind of facilitated this whole interaction. So I'm grateful for that. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in today. I know you have a lot you could be doing with your evenings, but you chose to listen to me talk about this very important story, to me, of course, and hopefully to others. And so all I'd ask is, yeah, please, you know, pick up a copy of the book, either for yourself or someone you love. You know, it's just, it would mean the world to me, and I think it's a timely and important story. So I just want to, again, thank you all for this opportunity. People are always very appreciative when I come and speak, but I tell them I'm appreciative of you, right? You actually really do me the honor of allowing me just to talk about this story. So thank you so much for that.
And thank you. It's a compelling story. Everyone should know that the link for your book, again, is in the chat. I linked it, bought it. It's usable, workable, very quick. And Joe, thank you too. And thank you, as Dan said, everyone has choices, and thank you for choosing to join us tonight for this wonderful talk. So have a great night. Dan, great to see you in person. And Joe, thank you so much for the recommendation. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Eden, Michelle, Joe, thank you all very much.
Of course.
Good night.